Hey guys, this is Valde from Moji here. Danish Counter-Strike is one hell of a drug, but so is Thorin's YouTube channel.
Right, this is going to be another episode of Reflections, and my guest for this one is going to be Valde, who obviously, well, at the time of this interview, technically, no one knows what team he will play for in the future. But most recently, when he wasn't on the bench, he played for OG, obviously, and then past that, there's North and Heroic and all the other teams, right? Obviously, since this is a reflections interview, it's about your whole career. This is actually, I'm going to get a chance with you. I actually haven't had many people who've been through this process yet, where I can sort of update fans of how I run this. Because you might remember years and years ago, it's a long time ago, that was in 2017, I actually did one of my Talk to Thorin episodes with Valde. And what I did with that series, if people don't know, is I just realised there was sort of like a gap in the content between sort of like the equivalent of like, you know, the day interview, which is like, what happened last match, what do you think? And then the problem is the reflections one's like, it's almost like your whole career. And I noticed there wasn't really anything in the middle, and it felt a bit awkward sometimes if I did like reflections with someone after like a year and a half of their career. Meanwhile, you know, the other ones with like a 12-year veteran, like Get Right or something. So that basically now people will see, now if you go back to 2017, it's like it's more like the middle one, and now we're here to do a bigger one. So let's just start out here, Valde. Actually, one thing I like about reflections as well is sometimes I like to revisit topics I might have talked to you about in the past, but obviously now, I mean, that was 2017, so it's like 5 years later at this point in time, a lot might have changed. So let's start there. Famously, a detail about you that a lot of people will know is that actually your age is much older for when you got to the top level, tier 1 in Heroic, than normally people are. Weren't you already something like 23 or something? You were a lot older than the others, right?
Yeah, a little bit older. I think 23 is a little too high. As far as I remember it, I was 20 when I started in Copenhagen Wolves. So I think I was around 21 when I started in Heroic, but that was like the really early days. But it's still, you know, older than, for example, like a guy like Monacy, who's literally like 16 when they start out, right? So I guess I was a little bit above average in that sense.
Because I do remember you telling me the story of like what you were doing in the scene and then the initial teams you got into. But actually, my question now, and like the fact it's years later and that you're still going into your career now, is I wanted to ask about a different angle with you, which is one thing I was first introduced to, believe it or not, from actually like the UFC and MMA, was the concept that when you're judging like the age of an athlete, you don't just go off the raw number. It's not like, right, he's 36, so this guy. What they went off in UFC, as you can imagine in that sport, was more like wear and tear. It's like, actually, the real question is how long have you been fighting? Because as you will find out, there's people, like I'll give you an example, there was a really great fighter called Shogun in the light heavyweight division, and he's actually not even that old now, mate. He's still like, I think, you don't even know if he's 35, but the point is now he's semi-washed because he's fought a million fights. He's been knocked out loads of times in his career. Meanwhile, there was a guy famously in the UFC in the early days called Randy Couture, and because he only started like the fighting portion of his career, he'd be like a wrestler before that, because he only started the fighting portion of his career like his like mid-30s, he was able to go into his 40s and still look like really amazing. So at the time, people were like, wow, doesn't he age? But it's like, actually, if you looked at like the wear and tear angle, it made sense. Like, actually, it's logical that like he could keep going and the other guy couldn't. So what I want to ask you is if there's something similar, because I've noticed actually with the guys who are a bit older when they get up there, and even look, it's more extreme, but I'd say Roy's done a similar thing to you. We sort of come along later. Does that mean the fact that like you actually haven't had that many years as a pro though? Do you think that means that your career can be longer? So whereas like, for example, like I'm sure Device has been playing since he was like 15 at Lands or something. Does that mean if Device felt burned out at 28, could Valde still be playing in his 30s? Do you think this angle maybe gives you actually a longer career potentially?
I think it's a tough question, but I think there definitely is an angle that if you start out at a later age, then obviously you didn't achieve anything yet. And I think motivation for me is probably like the single biggest factor in terms of career longevity, because like if I have a guy that's like say 26 or 28, if he literally didn't achieve anything and he didn't get to the top level yet, I think personally, you know, he's as motivated as the 18-year-old kid or whatever. Like, so I do think there is some truth to that, but I don't think you can take it out in like as like a single factor and say that because you start out at an older age, then you can also play until you're older. So I think it's a little bit of both. Yes.
Because even though these are some, you know, more like the questions I'd ask at the end, I thought it would be a cool place to start. Like another question I have along those lines goes, since you did start at a later age, and now obviously, like everyone, you've had a year, 2 years stolen from you because of the online period, and then add in, you've just had the bench period. Do you ever feel like in your career, like, have you been unlucky? Have you had satisfaction? It feels like there's only been sort of a few years where you felt like everything was in place.
Yeah, like the overall answer to that question is definitely yes, but you know, I hate to be the person that's kind of like whining about those kind of things, because at the end of the day, you know, some of it is your own fault in terms of like what contracts you sign. Some of it is literally like timing, randomness, you know, in terms of when an organization is making the changes compared to when your own contract is running out. So in that sense, I feel like I've been a little unlucky at times, but yeah, you know, when you look back at it, I think if you regret all sorts of things, it won't really help you. So I think it's just about like keep on grinding and keeping the motivation high, and then you go from there.
Another thing that's quite cool is if we go over some of the initial parts of your early career when the Heroic team first came along, and if people don't know, this is when the brand Heroic was first known. It was formed as a squad. Obviously, there was some like behind the scenes things where you might know some of the people who formed other teams, etc. But that's all separate now, and this is years ago. When this squad was first formed, though, funnily enough, it was already a team that very quickly became known for having young, good Danish players. But there's actually a cool angle now, which is aged like fine wine, which is the team had both Snappi, who now this year is mega relevant again, and of course Glaive in the team. So actually, let me ask about these guys. So let me start with the Glaive angle. One thing that I think has always been missed by a lot of fans, because fans now will just know Astralis Glaive and they'll know he won the 4 majors and he's the GOAT, you know, the simple narratives everyone knows. I think the detail they often miss, Valde, is he actually wasn't the IGL in this team. He was the secondary caller. And so what was it like to play with him? Because obviously now he's sort of known as like a good fragger for an IGL and like as known as the God caller. So who was Glaive back in Heroic when you met him?
As far as I remember, you know, he took the long break when he was sort of like out of the scene for, I don't know how long it was, like a year or something. Then he came back into, I believe it was like the Copenhagen Wolves roster. And back then, I feel like his logic was that the team was not very good firepower-wise, because they still had a lot of like the 1.6 players. People remember probably like Freeze, those type of people. So I felt like, you know, he wanted to still contribute with his firepower and his individual playing. So he didn't want to in-game lead back then. So yeah, but he was like a super awesome guy to play with. You know, he's a very vocal player. He has a lot of authority. You know, so when Glaive says something, you really listen to it. Especially if you were a younger guy like me back then. So yeah, I have nothing but good to say about him. He was a really nice guy to play with. You know, you always felt like he was in control. And I think a guy like Snappi, who was kind of new to CSGO back then as well, really felt the impact of having a guy like Glaive on your team. You know, he's obviously going to help you with secondary calling, like the decisions, just like managing the team in general. And then I think most importantly, he had a really good view of the game, both like tactically and like in terms of like the mid-rounding as well, right? So I think that was like his biggest strength.
Do you ever wonder, because obviously, if people don't know as well, it was actually a gamble when Astralis picked up Glaive at this time because of his history. He wasn't an IGL. Basically, if people don't realise, they just essentially, because they knew, like, we've sort of reached an impasse with karrigan, it's not getting better. The point of the time was there wasn't any other people, unless you were going to go for MSL, basically, he was the only other legit person. It was going to have to be a gamble like MSL, Snappi, or in this case, they went with Glaive because they thought maybe he can, like, recreate what he did in the past. So I almost feel like people don't realise, if Astralis had been amazing that year, maybe Glaive just stays in this team. Maybe he's never even an IGL. Like, what do you think? What would history be like if that team just stayed together? Do you ever wonder?
Yeah, that's like a crazy thought, but I do remember when I think back. I remember when Astralis approached us and we realized that they were looking to like take Glaive into the team. I always had the gut feeling that Astralis team was gonna do amazingly. Like, obviously, I didn't know it was gonna end up being as good as it was. But I just remember like getting a personality like him with the skill set that he has compared to what karrigan had back then. I just felt like something special was in the making. And a funny story was that actually, like, I won't say who, but I was sort of like promised a little bit that they were going to do what they could to actually bring me into the Astralis lineup back then. And this was like all the way back when I think kNg still played in the team possibly.
Okay.
Or was it just after him? But
I think like, it'd probably be when KB just joined, but yeah, sure.
Yeah, but it was basically like the really early Astralis days, right?
Right.
But for different reasons, it didn't end up happening. And then I obviously stayed with Heroic for a long time after that. And then, yeah, the rest is history, I guess.
On the Snappi angle, the way I wanted to ask about that was, obviously now when he's doing really well with ENCE, people are going to think, this is the problem, unfortunately, with like the way people do fan opinions, because they make them so extreme. They're either going to be like, see, he was amazing all along, or they're going to be like, how's this guy at the top again? Whereas what I would assume is it was so many years ago. I'm sure Snappi is a different player. He's been through all these experiences since. So who was Snappi at the time? And being as you're an in-game leader yourself now, how would you speculate maybe he's changed? Because obviously, I mean, he must have done something to be relevant in 2022 if this is 2017 we're talking about.
Yeah. I think, first of all, as I mentioned before, I remember like when we played in Heroic, I think all the rest of us on the team, so the 4 others, apart from Snappi, we already had like 4,000 or 5,000 hours in the game.
Right. Okay.
And I believe he had like 2,300, like literally half the amount that we had. So he still had a lot to learn. Like it was like basic stuff like the movement, the nade throwing aspect. This might sound crazy since he was like in a professional team,
Sure.
but still, he only had half the hours. But I think he's always been like a super intelligent guy. Who's like good at decision making, and I think he's also been a little bit unlucky, with his teams throughout his career. But back then he was like, I guess, pretty inexperienced in the in-game leader role, and I think he was even doing a little bit of AWPing as well. So I think he spent the last couple of years like finding himself, and also like refining his in-game leadership. And I think that's what you kind of see in this current ENCE roster, that he's also developed a lot since the early years. And like you said before, I don't think you're the same person in like 2022 as you were all the way back in like 2016 or whatever. People do really develop over time, and you gain a lot of experience from playing with like a number of different players on different teams, different organizations, all that kind of stuff. So I think he's had like a bit of a, what do you call it, like a redemption arc the last year or so, where he's really proved that he can be one of the top in-game leaders in the game.
Even though now it is going to be a long time ago, the big result from Heroic I want to ask about is, of course, when you're in the semi-finals of Katowice in 2017, the one that people might know was the last one that the Astralis team won with the Kiebi lineup. You guys were in the semis. You were playing against FaZe Clan, the one that had an equal. Like, this was a big result at the time. Your team was one that had done upsets to get there. Sure, it was like a team that had upset potential, but if people don't realise, like, one of the problems I always think when you break down CS results is you can have tournaments, like the best example would probably be like some of the Star Ladders. There's some Star Ladders, dude, that have better rosters than a major. They have like unbelievable fields.
Yeah.
But sometimes the final is just in that cyber arena. It's not the same as being on stage, whereas like Katowice is Katowice, but you are still on like one of the most big stages that everyone wants to be on. If you get there, you've got to already start thinking maybe you can win the championship. Like, this must have been a big moment in your career.
Yeah, for sure. And pretty, like, if I'm not mistaken, this was the tournament where we're literally in like the group of death. Like we had
Yes, you were
a fucking tough group. Sorry for swearing, but
no, it's good.
Like I just looked at the HLTV page and I could see like we played. So we're in a Heroic, right? We're literally like the third best Danish team back then.
Yep.
And we started out by playing North, who was obviously like above us in the rankings. Then we played Cloud9. Then we played SK Gaming, Navi, Virtus Pro, and then we met Astralis in the semifinals. So that just gives you a pretty good idea of like that. Yeah. That's a fucking tough road, right? And I remember when we played the group stage, when we played the final game against Virtus Pro, which we won, I believe if we won that game, we finished first in the group, and we obviously went directly into the semis. But if we lost that game, we'd literally be out in like 5th or 6th place in the group. So that one game, because the group was so close, literally made the difference between us going out in like last place or going straight to the semis. So that was like a crazy format back then, especially when the groups were this tough, right? So it was literally like do or die in those types of group stages.
Yeah, I should say I misspoke. I was thinking of Immortals. Obviously, you played the other side of the bracket. You played Astralis. Like, here's the question I have, though. It's a bit of a bomber question, but I've got to ask it, which is this. After this team, which, by the way, have perfectly fulfilled its like promise of like it brought some new old players back in the scene, some new players in the scene, had a couple of runs, some upsets, but then people went on and Clave went to Astralis and you went to this team. Right, here's the problem I have with this move, is if I look where Heroic was roughly positioned, and then when you went over to North, look, North accomplished more, but I feel like you've never gotten past that level in CS. You've always sort of been stuck at sort of like the 5th to 10 type place in the rankings. And like I say, maybe the odd result of North made them slightly peak a bit more, but it feels like even though you might have thought when you were going to North you're taking the step up, you've never really gotten you haven't got to go to the top of the scene yet. Do you get the same vibe?
Oh yeah, and that's, I think at the end of the day, that's what's keeping me going to this day, is the fact that, I never played in the big major final. I never lifted like one of the, like except for the Stockholm one, I never lifted like the Cologne trophy, the Katowice trophy, stuff like this. So I think deep within me, that's still what keeps me going. But yeah, it's true. I think what people got to remember back then was that we had I would say like a way stricter hierarchy in terms of the Danish teams compared to what we have now. Because nowadays, you know, one day it's like Astralis is the best team, the next day it's Heroic. I think the teams are a bit more even. But back then we really had a strict ladder where it was like Tricked was probably in 4th place, then Heroic was in 3rd, North was 2nd, and Astralis was obviously like by far and away the best Danish team. So I think, especially when you were a little bit younger as a player, if you got an offer from one of the teams above you, it was kind of like a no-brainer and you always wanted to go for it. And I think that was kind of my logic as well back then. And then there's also I think every player gets a little bit fatigued after they played in the same team for like numerous years through different roster changes, etc. Then I think most players feel the need to have like a fresh start, you know, with some fresh teammates, you know, just like a new beginning, I guess. And I remember I felt that way back then. Even though in hindsight, you know, you never know how it would have went if I stayed on the old Heroic team.
By the way, just as an aside, I don't know if you've got a story or if you just got some comment to give, but I noticed also one of the first tournaments you actually went to in North, because you won it, was the now notorious Dreamhack Montreal. And the reason it's notorious is not because you won it, it's because the people you played in the final, think of what I'm saying here, fans, in the final, you were at least scheduled to play Immortals, but for some reason, obviously not all of them turned up. And that was obviously also the tournament where the infamous kNg tweet to FNS happened. So, do you have any story for this? It must have been a fucking bizarre, surreal final, right? It was like one map or so, wasn't it? Like,
yeah. I guess now it's like, 5 years ago, so I can probably tell like the story, how I remember it.
Yes.
How it actually played out. But so when I just joined North, we were on a bit of a hot streak. You know, we did pretty well in Pro League. We obviously won like we came into the final of the Malmö tournament.
Yes.
And that
which was a Dreamhack Masters. That was a big event. Yeah.
Yeah, and that, I believe that was my very first tournament with North, right?
Yes.
And then after that, we traveled to Montreal, where we played like the Dreamhack Open, which was like a decent tournament.
It was like a solid, yeah, some like bottom level of tier 1 people, yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Cloud9 and stuff, yeah.
Yeah. And then obviously we're meeting the Brazilians in the final. And then when we went to the stage at the arena to set up, we just noticed that there's like a couple of Immortals players missing, right? So we didn't think too much about it, other than, okay, it's a little bit crazy, you know, that it's like literally 20 minutes until the game and they haven't showed up. What's going on? But, you know, everybody was on their own PC, just minding their own business. So we didn't really realize what was going on.
Plus, you do sometimes get those pros who are like, they're smoking outside till the last possible minute, and then they're going to run in, and,
like,
especially if they're big players, try and get an extra 5 minutes. I get normally that's what people don't know about that story, dude. Is as long as you're reasonable, you can always get like 5 minutes more sometimes. More, it's not as strict as people made out.
No,
exactly.
Like nowadays, you literally get fined if you're too late, right? But back then, you could like manipulate the admins a little bit, you know,
because they want the match to happen. Exactly, yeah. They don't want to forfeit you. Exactly.
Yeah. So it was a different scene back then. But yeah, then, and obviously we knew, by the way, that the Brazilians are always super dangerous to play against because they're like a momentum-based team, right?
This is when they've been in the major final, remember? Yeah.
Yeah, so if they get going, like no matter if they just came straight to the PC after, I don't know, whatever they did, you know, they were still a super dangerous team, you know, so we didn't think too much about it. But then at one point, the Dreamhack admins comes up to us and says, two of the Immortal players hasn't shown up. So if they're not here in like 10 minutes, we're gonna fight the first map. Like you're just gonna straight up win the first map, and then we just play one more map. And then we actually, like, first of all, we're like, what the fuck is going on? You know, it's like, it's a final, like, what's happening? But then secondly, we actually wanted to win the final in a legit way, because we knew, by the way, that if we only win one map, it's gonna look kind of shady, right? Like, nobody's gonna give us proper credit for actually winning the final straight up. So we actually told the admin, like, no, it's fine, like, we're cool with it. They can be, you know, of course, like a limited time, but they can be 30 minutes late, whatever. We're just gonna sit here, warm up, and then they can show up. But then the Dreamhack admin tells us, like, we actually have a rule set we gotta abide by, and if they don't show up within 10 minutes, we're gonna fight you we're gonna give them a default loss on the first map. And then all of a sudden, you know, the missing players comes to the stage, And we could just see that they're like arguing and they're pretty tilted. So we just think to ourselves like, okay, I like, because they got the fight loss on the first map by now. And then we play the map. I think it's Cobblestone, like best of one final. I don't think it's ever happened before, but you know, we just rolled with it. We won the map, and then it was just like a surreal feeling because normally when you play like a best of 3 final against another good team, you know, it's like a 3-hour brawl. It takes a long time. You're really exhausted afterwards. But we literally just showed up, played for 30 minutes, and then we won the final. And then afterwards, we just learned that, I don't know what the story was back then, but they probably went to a nightclub the night before. Or I don't know exactly what happened. But then when we get back to the hotel, I went outside to the hotel had like a sky bar where there was like an outside smoking area. Okay. And I'm outside with MSL smoking a cigarette. And then I believe it's like the Immortals coach or manager or something just comes out to us. And then he just lets us know. He just opens the door. Then he just says, "Yo, guys, have you seen FNS?" And then we're like, nah, what's up? And then he just says to us, "Okay, but if you see him, please tell him to stay inside." Or something.
There you go.
Like
Exactly. Yes.
and we just
you're just thinking, what?
We just look at each other and we have no idea what's going on because at this point, you know, we haven't seen the tweet and all that.
Right.
And,
yes.
And then we just see. I don't remember if we see kNg, but we just see the Brazilians like not running around, but like looking for someone at the hotel, like the hallways, right? And we're just like, what the fuck is going on? Then we check Twitter, and then we obviously see all the drama and stuff. And then we just had a good laugh about it. And I think there was even a good after party at that tournament or whatever. But
I couldn't believe it. Yeah,
that's one of probably the craziest things that had happened to me in esports.
Yeah, like I say, I didn't think there was going to be anything like cool on the North Star, but I figured I have to ask that question. And also, like you say, the statute of limitations surely ended on that. It was 2017, guys. Like, let it go. It was ages ago now. So, okay, let's get into the rest of it then. Because here's the thing. Obviously, like we've already talked a little bit, like the Malmo result making the final was a good result. I've always said, dude, when I look back, right, this is just how different teams can be in the server from on paper. When I look at the lineup of this team, bro, it's like you, MSL, AZ, fucking kNg-IMT and Config. Mate, even now I think that should be amazing team. Like, mate, someone make that team tomorrow. Like, that team looks fire on paper. Like, even though, yeah, you had a couple of good runs and obviously, like, shouldn't this team have accomplished more?
I think so, yeah, in terms of if you just look at the names on paper. But I think, unfortunately, you know, we were a little bit limited by the fact that North was a new organization still back then. And I think we had some mismanagement. I don't think it's as bad as it's probably made out to be now that, you know, people know the rest of the North history. But I think the thing that probably hindered us the most was probably like the personal issues we had on the team. I feel like we constantly had somebody who had like some kind of personal issues, maybe a little bit of role clashes. I don't know, we just couldn't get things going. And I think back then people weren't as mature as they are now. So I'm pretty sure, you know, if you could rewind the time back, I think a lot of us would have made different decisions for like obvious whatever reasons. So yeah, it's one of those teams where I really felt like we could have benefited from having like a second chance. But you know, done is done, and obviously you can't turn back in time. But yeah, I think the personal issues was probably like the main reason why we didn't do better as a team, because I really do think we showed great potential at times, but we just weren't able to keep it consistent. And I think obviously, as people know, consistency is key for a CSGO team. And then, you know, all the CSGO teams, especially the top teams, has this tendency of, let's say you're even like a top 3 team in the world, even though you're technically a really good team, if you're not able to take that final step, then most teams are actually willing to gamble your whole position as a team in order to reach like from the third best team to becoming the best team. And I think a good example of this is probably the Vitality team of last year, you know, when they still had a French roster, all the way back when they actually had RPK and stuff. You know, I remember I said back then, I felt like it was a huge mistake that they made the roster changes, because they were so, like, they were in like 6 finals, but obviously they didn't win any of them. And then at the end of the day, I feel like they probably felt the pressure to do a roster change, you know, because the community was, I don't know, saying it's like not good enough, something's going wrong in these finals. But I think if you look at it objectively, they've never come close to that old lineup's peak performance. But yeah, it's just for the fans sometimes where people don't understand sometimes why you do these roster changes, but it's because, you know, most of the people playing are such winner personalities, so they're not satisfied coming second or whatever, you know, so you always try and strive for that, like, top one in the world, and that's probably the reasons why a lot of rosters actually end up going to shit, even though, you know, you get like numerous top fours along the year or whatever.
One thing I want to ask about with this specific lineup in terms of how it ties into the rest of your career, and this is just an open-ended question, so you answer it however you want, is I always got the vibe as an outsider watching you specifically play in this team, that because you're joining a team where, like, let's be real, all the other four are really experienced, and in fact, some of them, like kNg and KGB, are enormous personalities if people don't know. These aren't just like big names, like these are guys who are like in the server, like they're going to have something to say about how we do things and who plays what and who gets what resources and who gets the AWP and who, you know what I mean? Like, so in this, I always wondered in this particular iteration, did you try and take more of a backseat? Were you more of like a supportive element or something? Because I always felt like, on the one hand, I felt like you could have been a better player in this team, but also I've noticed in teams, sometimes, my example would be like in Mouse now, for example, I said, in some ways, Rops leaving that Mouse team could be the best thing for someone like Frozen, because now in theory, he's got space to, if he's going to become a Rops, he's got space to grow into it. So was there any of that in this team? Because I felt like it was the teams after this, which, by the way, had worse lineups in North. You became a much better player, it felt like. So was there any of that going on?
100%. I think you're totally on point. I do think I got a little bit of a supportive role, and I think that was normal back then, because when you're the fifth guy and you already joined like a pretty good team, then you probably do get some of the bitch roles, and you do get put in some of the positions where maybe you're not like 100% comfortable. And, you know, I came from a heroic team where I had a lot of the star positions, or whatever you want to call them. So yeah, when you come into a team, you know, and a guy like kNg is already there, you know, kNg is there, etc., then you do sort of have to fill the void and just, you know, be a little bit of everything. And I think that definitely hurt some of my individual performance and also my confidence at times. And I think that's also the reason why, as you just said before, why I probably played way better at the later stage of North, because I had different positions, you know, I had a more of a voice on the team, and I was able to play more like how I wanted, right? And I think that showed in the numbers as well.
One thing I want to ask about, because obviously this is good, we're going to touch on this topic again later, maybe in the OG era, because actually I think what's actually given you a lot of shine and maybe made people rethink about you for the top teams is that you've actually become very good at doing some of the hard, like, anchor spots and some of the shit positions that normally people don't want to do because it's like a one and done on CT and you don't get the stats from that. I'd actually say you've gotten kind of like a bit of shine from the analysts on that angle. So along those lines, one thing I want to ask was this. One position that I've always thought is actually a very tricky CT position to play that people don't get the full credit for, but if you can be like the support player and you do it, I would say the player Taco showed that you can get mad props. I've always thought you were really good on inner train, dude. Lower inner train. When you used to play that in North, you were a fucking banger on that. That is a really, like I said, that's not just a hard, that's a tricky position, because that's one where you can just be surrounded at any moment in time. It's tough. And listen, everyone loves it when you get the highlight where you just kill the three people coming down and spraying them. But like, think how many times that doesn't happen where the flash rolls down and the guy above you. Like, people don't realize that's a really tough spot to play, right? So give me some thoughts on this. And also, can you give us like, it's not like a tips and tricks, but what do you think, like, what's the essence of what that sort of a player has to be able to do to play that spot, do you think?
Yeah, it's true. Like, I've always had the philosophy that if you're a good player, you can turn any position into a good position. Like, obviously, you can never turn B Mirage into Connector Mirage, because like there's just way more action on Connector. But I do think if you're a good player with good individual skill and good understanding of the game, then you can turn pretty much whatever position into like a comfortable, good position, where you can still showcase some of your skill. Even though it's like a super tough position. And I think inner train is a perfect example of that, because yeah, it's true, like when you get hit by inner execute or like the fast inner pop timing, where like you have no teammates, you have no backup, people are coming out from upper, dropping on top of you, coming down from the lower ramp, there's like a million flashes. That's super hard to deal with, but still, you know, if you have a good understanding of the game, you kind of know like what angle to take, what duel to take first, then you can probably play a little bit of time. Then you also got to know like, this round I should probably play retake. You know, there's a lot of mind games going into those solo positions, because one thing people also don't understand is that if you play bad, if you have a bad game in one of these positions, then people might think, yeah, but it's the least important position, so it doesn't matter that much. But if you like, if B-side train is open, then then
no one's ever gonna have to go outside, are they? So yeah, good luck.
Yeah, so it's like
true.
People will see it as a weak side. They'll keep hitting you over and over again. Then, you got to have a teammate constantly with you on inner. Now outside is a weak spot. They're going to manipulate. The good teams are going to manipulate you like that. Then they're going to hit outside on the perfect timing. Then your teammate's probably like, I should be outside now. And then you feel all the blame for calling him to inner to help you, because you feel like you got fucked the previous rounds. So, there's a lot of mind games and stuff like that goes into playing those solo positions. And I think the teams that has these really good solo anchors are also, like, if you look at some of the top teams, you can see a guy like Perfecto or Navi, who plays these positions pretty much perfectly. You see how valuable that is, because the whole team just trusts this guy, that he can hold like his own bomb site, and he will buy you as much time as he can, and he will get you those like 1 or 2 kills, even staying alive for a little bit, So I think it's really valuable having a player like this on all teams.
Right, being as people have, like, I've asked basically every player I've ever interviewed who was in the North team that won Dreamhack Stockholm what it was like, and they've gone through all the details and all. So people know most of the stories. But what I wanted to ask you was this, Valde. The part I've always found puzzling is just, essentially, here's the part of the backstory that I don't have, that doesn't make sense in the movie, that I need to sort of make it, that's why, right? Is, even though people say famously it was only like 2 weeks after or something that, like, obviously MSL got fired after the major went badly, even though he's just won one of the biggest tournaments in the world as the MVP over like the Astralis team that no one could be, like, at the time, like, the problem I have with this, essentially, here's the question, Valde. What could be so bad behind the scenes or with MSL's relationship with North that even winning that tournament doesn't even buy you, like look, at least a couple more lands. Like, don't fire me the next one. You know what I mean? Like, that makes it feel like, that sounds like the other way around, Valde. Like, they were like, look, the second we can get rid of this guy, just fire him. Oh, fuck, he's won a tournament. Well, wait one more. Oh, he's lost this one. Right, fire him now. Like, that makes it sound like it must have just completely have collapsed, because I know plenty of teams would have let you someone hang around like a year longer if you won a tournament like that. So what would your explanation be?
I mean, when I look at it in hindsight, that's probably like the single decision that I regret the most. But what's important to explain here is that we as a team didn't take that decision like the organization did. So I remember we literally, like, we met at the office like a Monday morning. Then we got called to the 9th floor, and that's like the management CEO floor. Right. So we knew, like, when you have a meeting up there, it's usually like,
that's the bad sign.
Yeah, that's right. A bad sign, right? Okay. And then we meet up there early in the morning. And then MSL is just like not in the room. And then I think all of us kind of saw the writing on the wall that he wasn't here anymore. And, none of us really stood up for him, but I think we were in a position where none of us really could, if that makes sense. Because,
I mean, you also filled the major, so I guess they could have just fired you off if they wanted, right? That's probably what you're feeling like.
Yeah, so there was a lot of tough decisions to be made. And I think also some of it was that he made some tweets that went against some sponsor stuff. So I think that's like the main reason why he was kicked out from the team. And then if you add on top like the bad major result, that was like the icing on the cake, I guess, or like the tip of the iceberg. So yeah. But it's like, it was a really messy situation. And even when I try and recall it in my head just now, I feel like it all happened so fast, and then all of a sudden, he was just out of the team. And again, like I explained before, we never really got like that second chance of doing well. Because when I look back at it, like, not making a major sucks, but I still think we had so much more to give and show with that lineup back then. So yeah, that's really one of the big regrets, that we didn't get to keep that lineup for a longer period of time.
And then people might know, obviously, after this period in time, Valde becomes the in-game leader, right? Now, you once said, I remember it was actually on Counterpoints, a line that I've referenced many times since, because I thought it was essentially just a great way of showing how star players, when they eventually get a little taste of in-game leader, realise it is a totally different world. Where you said on Counterpoints, I asked you something like, what did you think of MSL's system now you've been in IGL? And your line, which is a great line, is you said, I didn't actually know we had a system when I played with MSL, but when he left and I had to become the in-game leader, I sort of realised, like, oh, shit, that's how it worked. Like, oh, there was a whole, like, you know, like system protocol. Like, we had to, give me like the rough explanation of what you mean by that, because it's interesting, certainly like an intriguing thing to hear a pro say, right?
Yeah, it is really hard to explain, because like when you hear the word system, you think it's something like physical. You know, he had a fucking, I don't know, like a drawing of like how tactics are made or how the setups are.
They probably think of it like Blade when he hands up the folders to each person,
like,
or they all read like, yeah, exactly.
Yeah, but that's not what I mean by system. What I mean is like when you have a leader type person, think like karrigan, glaive, MSL, they have a certain way of doing everything. So it's like, it's the match preparation, it's the call, it's the timings of the stuff they call, you know, it's the setups, it's the way you're going through stuff in practice. All this, when you add it up, becomes the system. So sometimes when people think, yeah, I'm just going to become the in-game leader, they think like watching a few demos, making some strats, like calling them a server. I think that's like that's probably like the easy part. The hard part is staying consistent with that and like keep on watching those demos, like keep refining the strats. If something is not working, switching it. And I think the single most important thing is probably not giving up. I think a lot of people, you know, who swap to the in-game leader role, they actually give up too easily, or they want to get back to being a player, or all this kind of stuff. And as you probably see with probably all the top in-game leaders at this point in the game, even the ones that are really successful now, they had some fucking tough periods in their career where they were just like out from the team, you know, for whatever reason. Think karrigan in FaZe, karrigan in Astralis, Snappi, you know, before he came with ENCE, where was he the last 2 years or whatever? So it's a really unforgiving role. And that's why I also feel like they're the ones who deserves like the utmost credit when things are going right, because they are also the first one getting all the blame when stuff goes wrong, right? So that's kind of what I meant with that comment back then, is that, you know, when you're a star player in a system, it feels really comfortable, it's really easy, like you know what to do, you know your role, and then everything else comes pretty easily, right? Because you're not the one making the calls, you're not the one watching all the demos or whatever. So yeah.
I mean, another thing along these lines I wanted to touch on is basically, I think that a lot of star players find when they become IGL is a lot of them really do just think that like all the IGLs are the same and that they all just watch the same demos and figure out like, does this make sense? Right, well, I would rotate like, and they think like, right, well, if I just watch the demos, then I could do the same thing. But one thing I would touch on what you were saying is like my way of explaining it would be, I would also say this, if you take all the great in-game leaders, look, there's obviously a bit of wiggle room. Like if you have kNg-IMT as your star player versus Nico, you're going to structure the team differently, obviously, but to some degree, right, I would say most of the great in-game leaders, the reason they define the style of the team is because, as you're saying, sometimes even just like the logic of like the protocols within the game come from what they prefer. So for example, maybe you have an in-game leader who loves to do like super fast retakes at all times. Like the second the site gets taken, he wants the first guy to, you know, outside the site to push in and try and stop the bomb plant or something. Maybe there's a guy obviously who likes the opposite, like really slow, like we're going to lurk all over the map, get all the info. Like these are the things where that doesn't just come from watching a demo. It comes from like essentially you figured out your own sort of rules of how to play Counter-Strike, in the same way as obviously when you see like managers in football, like Pep Guardiola clearly coaches his football team differently to someone in the Bundesliga or something, you know, like they all have different styles and philosophies. So here's my question, because I feel like that's the hard part when you become the in-game leader. You can watch the demos, you can get everyone in their roles, but then coming up with that part, that's like you have to spend a lifetime thinking about that. Like what do I think is better? Is A better than B in style? Like how do I approach a certain, like how do I approach like an up-tempo Vega Squadron team versus how do I play versus Astralis? So my question to you would be, did you get any of that figured out when you were IGL? Did you get sort of a sense of how you think the game should be played, or how Valde sees Counter-Strike? Do you think you've got some of that down during your time as an IGL?
I think I did, yeah, but I was basically a perfect example of what I mentioned just before, of like giving up a little bit too early. because we actually did qualify for the major back then when I was in-game leading. We didn't make it far at the major, but we actually qualified for the major. And just now in OG, I didn't qualify for the previous 2 majors, so I know how hard it is to qualify for a major. Back then, maybe it was a little bit easier, I don't know, but still, we made it to the major, and that's actually something I'm like proud of to this day, that I managed to do that with the pieces I had back then. But I just feel like I was too young back then. I was not at a point in my career where I was willing to make that decision, make that switch 100%. And I think the reason why we did it was not even because I wanted to make that switch. I think it was basically because we were out of options, right? So yeah, that's how I remember it, because we actually did. I told this on a previous podcast as well, I believe, but we actually tried to get karrigan and Vox into the team from before they joined Mouse back then. But since that didn't happen, then
I heard basically didn't some higher up veto this move basically. I know it sounds terrible now, that move has aged very badly, whoever did that, but yes, believe it or not, a Danish person in a fucking Danish team went, karrigan, no thanks. You know what I mean? Some people can't be helped, can they? I know. Did they actually give you a reason? Obviously you don't have to say who it is, but did they have a reason they turned it down? What was the reason they wouldn't want him?
This might sound crazy, but I don't know 100% what happened, because I was obviously not a part of the North management, but I think the management felt like karrigan was a little bit too old/outdated in his ways of thinking. And I mean, obviously I didn't agree with that whatsoever, because I was primarily the one trying to get him into the team.
No doubt, yeah.
But yeah, that's basically what happened. And then, yeah, the rest is history. He went to Mouse, and then they ended up winning a bunch of trophies, so yeah.
Yeah, thanks North management, but whatever. Whatever. Here's the next question then. Another thing that's weird. This is why, by the way, your teams must be a nightmare for the kid who's trying to learn CS history through Liquipedia, because he's going to come to the heroic team and be like, oh, Glaive's the IGL. No, he's not going to know. He's going to come to this team. He's going to go, cadiaN and Valde played together. I wonder what it was like for Valde being under cadiaN's in-game leadership. You know what I mean? None of these teams are going to make any sense, Valde. So I'm going to ask the question that's the other way around from that, which is, what was it like to have cadiaN as your AWP? Because now it's weird. Now he is just an IGL. One thing I'll give credit to him, by the way, is he's actually committed to the role, but now he feels like a different player to me. I feel like I have to delete the part of his history before he was an IGL. So who the fuck was the cadiaN you got in North?
I don't even remember what team he played on when we took him. Was it the Rogue team?
It might have been that weird Rogue team. Yeah, I think so. Maybe the one that was a mix of American and fucking European players, maybe.
Yeah. Obviously cadiaN wasn't on the biggest Danish teams back then, so I felt like we primarily took him to take a chance on someone. I think he really proved himself during the Rogue times. They also were close to qualifying for the major back then, I believe, and he had played pretty good individually as well with the AWP. And obviously we needed an in-game leader, so I think we just decided to jump into it. But I remember when we got cadiaN into the team was already in such a big disarray that we had so many problems, so I felt like we never got a clean start. People didn't have a lot of motivation for different reasons, and there was just a lot of people were really divided in the team. So I really never feel like we got a chance to play again from a fresh start where everybody's putting 100% effort into it. And yeah, so I think it kind of turned out badly, but I have nothing but respect for what he did in Heroic, and I think he really proved that he can be a top tier in-game leader if he has the right team around him.
What was, because one thing I wondered about at that period of time was, obviously, like you say, he was actually quite a controversial figure. A lot of people in the Danish scene, for whatever past baggage reasons, didn't like him, and that's why he spent a lot of his career going to international teams, if people don't know. But the funny thing is now, I actually think he's rewritten his whole career. Now, as an in-game leader, he's got quite a cool storyline. I think people pull for him, aside from the obvious controversy the last few years, but I think aside from that, he's sort of a feel-good story. People like that he's become a pretty good IGL. This is the question I would have, is he's obviously someone else who went through this path we're talking about. He used to be, probably the most extreme example of a star. He was an AWP, he was just a guy who just watches the crosshair. Now he's been an IGL as well, trying to understand the game a lot. How do you think he's changed since he played with you? And was the guy who came to you, was he someone, could you tell he'd had sort of a bit of a tortured career? And because I always also got the vibe with him, by the way, that he's super grateful to sort of get this last chance to succeed finally, after maybe he thought it was never going to come,
Yeah, I think it was. But I think the most important thing is probably having the right team around him. I think he works best with like a team full of young people, who's willing to listen to him 100%, where he can like control how they play. And I think he has that in Heroic. He has some really good players there. But yeah, I think he's also, just from the role he plays, he probably isn't he the only one apart from Fallen who in-game leads while he plays the AWP. Maybe Nitro as well did it in Liquid at some periods of time. But that's a tricky thing.
It's very rare, of course, yeah.
Yeah, that's a really tricky thing to do, because obviously the AWP role is such like impactful in a team. So you really wanna be putting up the numbers at the same time as you need to be putting out the good amount of calls, right? So yeah, it's a tough role, and I think that's why so few people are actually doing it, because it's really tough. But I think he probably was really grateful he got the chance in Heroic, and then being able to turn that team into like a world-class team is probably something that he's really proud of.
What's wild is, people might know this story because I've told it on By the Numbers, but when they were making the OG team genuinely just comes from the two drama stories of the Starladder Berlin Major, because both teams, like Alexi B got cut from ENCE immediately, and then NBK was cut like instantly the second that Vitality lost. The two of them, after initially looking at the other options around there, obviously realised, like, why don't we just play together? And then you were around, so I heard you were like the initial core, and at the time NBK was like telling me potential players, and the crazy thing is, by the way, I always say this, I know it's going to sound a bit harsh because look, you might like mantuu, he certainly seems like a very amiable guy, he was a good player, he wasn't a great player. If you look at some of the other names though, before mantuu was the AWP, and to be fair, apparently he wasn't an AWP before this period in time, so maybe that's why he wasn't on the horizon. The names I was hearing was like Jampy, because obviously that turned out he was banned, Poison, who then later went to Complexity like the same time, and then eventually you went down the list and the mantuu guy came in, and Issa was the fifth one. Like, can you give me some thoughts on the formation of this team? Because like, without dissing anyone, all I'm saying basically is there's worlds where I feel like some of the other options, if we were like in an alternate timeline here, it might have been an even better team, or it might have been a stronger team from the beginning. What was the initial period of joining this team like?
Yeah, I remember, I'm pretty sure NBK was the one who contacted me on Steam or like Twitter or whatever, and just asked me if I could consider joining this team that he was making with the Alexi. And Issa, I believe, also was on the paper back then. But then the rest of the process, I was really not a part of it at all. I think NBK and Alexi, I guess, was primarily the ones building the team. And yeah, it's true, as you said before, like mantuu was not even an option back then. I'm pretty sure we started out with, I don't remember if Poison was the first one, but he basically abandoned ship and went to Complexity. Like, all of a sudden we just got like a Discord message of him choosing Complexity, because I think he got offered like a pretty big salary, to be fair.
The story is supposedly just came with like a checkbook, like, there you go, and then signed up, which by the way is a pretty baller move, I will say.
Yeah. So yeah, he went off to Complexity, and then we actually decided to go with the Yampy guy. And then after we practiced for, I don't remember exactly, but I think we only had a couple of prac days, then we found out that he was banned and couldn't play any major tournaments. And that was obviously like something we couldn't really live with. So I think it was, I believe it was the NKJ guy who was the coach for NPK back in one of the
I think in Envy. I think they were mates, yeah.
And he's German, right? If I'm not mistaken.
Yes.
And he apparently knew mantuu. Who,
I think because he was an alternate attacks or whatever, right? Yeah.
Yeah, but I don't even think he was the primary AWPer back then. He was like a hybrid player, I think. So he was rifling and AWPing.
Yes.
So he told us that mantuu had great potential and he could become an AWPer. And then I think for the lack of better options, we decided to go with mantuu and give him a chance. I also think because we felt like we had enough experience in the team, so we could actually go for like a younger guy who's a bit more inexperienced. So yeah, we ended up going with mantuu, and I think we found like a great player there, because he literally came from nowhere. Like, I had no idea how he was like as a person. I didn't see him play before anything like that. So yeah, that's how we ended up picking mantuu. So it was a little bit random, but yeah.
Yeah, I'll actually say, by the way, when I was told that story, I actually remember even saying people should have led with this as like the info about this guy, because even though now obviously he's being criticised, I mean, to be fair, he plays tier 1 AWP. Like, tier 1 AWP's the most scrutinised role in the game. It's like being a striker in the Premier League. Like, you have to score goals. I'm sorry, there's no, like, you can only excuse it for so long. Eventually, you have to score all the goals and win the game. That's the way the game works. So, but I'll say this. If he really was a guy who barely AWP'd, like, mate, he got really good really fast. Like, he obviously fucking must have put in mad hours, because you would never know this. Like, when the OG started rolling, he was already, like, a pretty decent AWPer, like, immediately, right?
Yeah, he's a hardworking guy. You know, he has a really good attitude. He's never complaining. You know, he's never whining. Listens to what people are saying. So yeah, he puts a lot of hours into the game, and I also think he did a really good job in terms of AWPing.
Right, it goes without saying that the whole circumstances as to why everyone in the world had to go online weren't great timing for everyone. That's an obvious understatement of all time, Valde. But in your case in particular, this OG team got completely fucked by this, because you just had that really good run at the Blast where you were beating EG and looking awesome against GT. Like, everyone was like, wow, this will be very interesting. And then there just never was any lands, basically. Like, they never got a chance to actually have the lands. And the joke is, like, you're about to leave OG without ever going to any of these motherfuckers. It's like, what was this experience? Because you know what I mean? Like, in the old days, like, no one could know this was going to last this long. Like, I'm sure everyone thought it's like a month or two or something. You know, it's kind of crazy, because I feel like basically OG never really got its chance, right?
Yeah, I think that first COVID year was probably the craziest year I've ever tried. You know, I'm pretty sure we went official with the team in, I believe it was November or something of 20...
makes sense. Yeah.
What was that, like
2019,
yeah. Then we played the Summit event. That was the first event we were invited to. Did okay. Then we played the Blast tournament, as you mentioned. Or maybe it was the Ice Challenge and then the Blast tournament.
Yeah.
And then after we did well at that Blast group stage, basically, what was it, like a couple of weeks after that, COVID came around. And then I think I counted, it was something like we didn't see each other after that tournament, like physically, you know, at a boot camp or whatever. We didn't see each other for, I think it was a little over a year.
Fucking hell.
Like, so we literally were just sat in our own room at home in our different countries. And people also got to remember we had Isa on the team, who was obviously playing from Jordan, right? So every single online tournament, every single online qualifier, etc., he had to play with like 70, 80 ping or whatever.
I'm sure the routing as well must have been shit to the European servers as well. It's not even just the ping, right? Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, like all the routing is trash. Yep. I think having a boot camp and playing there physically when you play these tournaments, no matter if it's like online tournaments or LAN tournaments, obviously, I think they benefit the international teams a little bit more, you know, because we don't get to see each other as often as the people who can just go to an office every day and see each other. Yes. So I think that really hurt us as a team, you know, not being able to. Also, when you have issues, by the way, it's a completely different thing having like an argument online via like TeamSpeak or whatever, compared to actually being in a room with each other. Because I think people are a bit more like respectful, you know, it's easier to come say like, hey, sorry, man, my bad or whatever after a game if something bad happened. Compared to when you literally just like disconnect from a TeamSpeak straight after a game, if you know what I mean. So yeah, I think that was a rough period, you know, not only for us, I'm not trying to make any excuses here, but I think like, especially for us as like a newly founded team where we didn't have a lot of LAN experience together, I think that really hurt our development. But I think even when I look back at it now, I believe we reached top 6 in the world when we were at our highest. And I actually think that's okay when I look back at things, if you consider that I think we're one of the only teams, maybe except for the ENCE team now, that actually went all the way into the top 10 from literally scratch. I think it's really, really hard to assemble a team of 5. Like when you don't have a core lineup already, I think it's really difficult to pick out 5 players, like even if it's good players, and making it work, because you literally start from scratch with everything, like playbook, playing style, you know, like the roles, like everybody got to compromise at some point, play a role they are not comfortable with. I think it's a really tough task, and I don't think people have cracked the code in terms of like making a team from scratch, because it is really hard and it takes a lot of time.
Sure. Yeah, as you say, obviously it was in the summer onwards where you guys had this run where you got the top placing because you had like the 4th at the CS Summit RMR. If people remember, that was like the European RMR. You had the top 4 at Dreamhack Summer, which was still like a good tournament that people were playing at. You had, let's see, 2nd at IEM New York Europe. And then obviously you had the Flashpoint one where you almost won and it was 2nd place at that one too. Like, in general, like this team was in a good place. As you say, I actually think in hindsight it looks better than it was at the time. Because at the time, I think the narrative was like, because the first part of the year when it went online, the team wasn't that good. I mean, it was a brand new team as well. Initially, people wrote the team off. And then in the summer, funnily enough, when all the other teams, all the big squads were falling, actually, this is when all the teams came up. It was your team, Heroic, Big. These teams all came to the top and kind of like got acclimatized in the online era. If you look at the roster of that team now, dude, I actually think people were way too harsh on that team. Like, this is a lot of players who've never been at the top. Like, that 5 collectively to be ranked number 6 in the world, that's legit, even if it is online player.
I think it was, yeah, and as you mentioned before, I actually do think we had our fair chances at winning tournaments. You know, I remember we met not the big team, like at the New York final, the online final, we met the FaZe team that had Kirby for that period of time, and you know, in my head at least, that was a really beatable team. You know, we definitely could have won that final if we showed up and played better CS on that day. Then we were also in the other final. What was it, like the Pro League semi-final or final or whatever, and obviously in the Flashpoint final as well. And I think, you know, if things went a little bit different and we could have won like 1 or 2 of those trophies, then we might have, like that team might have had a different path, right? But at the end of the day, you know, I do feel like we lacked a little bit of firepower, and we probably also lacked, you know, some team play aspects. So when you're not really like a 10 out of 10 in either of those, it's always going to be hard to reach like, you know, the top 5 or top 3 consistently. So I think overall I'm pretty happy with how it went. And yeah, it was just a really tough time playing against all the other teams in the online era when we couldn't boot camp or anything like that.
This video was kindly supported by Kill Your Inner Loser, Ahmed Hadjou, Matt Pugnatio Rajcula, Paul Villa, Travis Goff, Adam Oaks, Animosity, Bot Pounder 420, Hades, Jensen Go, Kovacevic, Pacey, Tobias Bernasconi, Tosh, Toucan, and as always, special thanks goes out to Jerky's Minion. Do you want to suggest a topic or a guest for my shows? Would you like to ask a question in my Patreon AMA? Maybe you want teasers, find out who the next Reflections guests are or upcoming talk show guests. Do you want to take part in one of those long donated discussions with me? Well, if any of the above or more sound interesting to you, put your money where your mouth is. Join the Illuminati today via the Patreon link in the description box below.